So I want to do another video, sort of where you should be video with Kant. Here we are focusing on the second categorical imperative, and as usual, it's important to go back to the text and remind ourselves exactly what Kant says it is, what the second categorical imperative actually tells you to do. And here it is: so act as to treat humanity, whether in thine own person or in that of any other, in every case as an end withal, never as means only. To treat others, in this case humanity, although we'll have to qualify that, what he means by humanity. And the word person is very important there. But for the moment, to treat others always as an end, never as means only. And that's what it says. So, as we know, the second categorical imperative, treat people as ends in themselves, never as a means to an end. Now, there's all sorts of ways that we can interpret that, and I will be doing that in this video. But I want to just remind us that this is what it says, and then there are the interpretations. So these second two Kant readings, which again are meant to give us a deeper grasp of this imperative, the second categorical imperative. There's something. It's kind of a winding way. I hope at the end of it we get to, in a clear way, we can see why this imperative emerges as a key rule or key precept or key imperative in Kant's philosophy. The thing really begins with his explanation of the two different sorts of imperatives. There are categorical imperatives, like the two that he gives us in his moral philosophy, and then there are hypothetical imperatives. And hypothetical imperatives are easy. They're the stuff of everyday life. Basically, if you want this, then do that. They're hypothetical in the sense that they are conditional. There is an imperative here, the do that, but the imperative is conditioned. It is relative to something else, and that's the if, the hypothetical conjecture. If you want this, then do that. We have examples. If you want to grow up to be big and strong, eat your veggies, Mom says. And, we think of Mom as a source of categorical imperatives, but she's really not. She's giving us a hypothetical. If you want to grow up to be big and strong, eat your veggies. So the command there, the imperative is eat your veggies, but it's conditional. If it's the case that you want to grow up to be big and strong, then you eat your veggies. Eat your veggies. Well, what if I don't care about growing up to be big and strong? Well, then, there's really no reason to eat your veggies. My stock example is if there, the hypothetical nature of it is a little bit more clear. If you want to get good at basketball, learn to dribble with both hands. Something I learned to my cost. If you really want to be good, you got to be able to go both ways. So the imperative there is learn to dribble with both hands, and it's conditional, right? That is, the idea is that the imperative only applies if the condition is fulfilled. That is, if you do want to get good at basketball, you should learn to dribble with both hands. What if you don't want that? Well, then there's no reason to. It's conditional. So a hypothetical imperative is conditional. It's an if-then. It tells you to do something, but only if you want something else. As you know of a categorical imperative is necessary. unconditional. That's what it means. It's an exceptionless. Right? The idea is that a categorical imperative applies to everybody all the time, and it does not depend on having some subjective want. That is, it doesn't depend upon, there's no if. Always act so that your maxim of action can serve as a universal law, period. It's categorical. There's no if. Always treat others as ends in themselves and never as a mere means to one of your ends, period. It's categorical. There's no conditional. It does not depend upon you valuing anything or subjectively or having any want or desire. So that is quite different. As we look over hypothetical imperatives, they're no problem. They're quite understandable. If you want this, then do that. That's a hypothetical imperative. And, if you want to graduate from college, apply and study and go to class. If you don't want to graduate from college, there's no reason to do those things. It's the stuff of everyday life. If you want this, then you need to do that. Whereas categorical imperative, it just says you need to do this, period. So the hypothetical imperative is not problematic. The categorical imperative is, right? Because we can ask, why should we follow the categorical imperative? Are there really categorical imperatives? Are there rules, like Kant says, precepts, rules, imperatives that we have to follow no matter what we want? Again, going back to his idea of morality is really about what we have to do, what we have a duty to do, rather than what we want to do. So why should we follow the categorical imperative? Well, here we get to question of value. Things having value. And Kant says there are two forms of value, two types of value: subjective value and objective value. Subjective value is what makes a hypothetical imperative understandable, sensible. Um, If you want a cheeseburger, go to McDonald's, right? The imperative is go to McDonald's. But it's dependent upon the condition. Well, if you want a cheeseburger. Right? So if this hypothetical imperative applies to me, it's because I like cheeseburgers. Right? That is, the cheeseburger has value for me. So then it's sensible for me to do what I need to do to get it, or go to McDonald's, or get a real cheeseburger or somewhere else. But McDonald's, it qualifies as a cheeseburger, I guess. So the idea is that cheeseburger has value for me. The cheeseburger is valuable, but the cheeseburger has only subjective value, meaning it has value because I value it. And it's my valuing it that makes the hypothetical imperative um, sensible. Right? If I didn't value it, the cheeseburger would have no value. Or if no one valued it, the cheeseburger would have no value. It has no intrinsic value. It has no objective value. It has no absolute value. Its value is only relative to someone valuing it. So the question is then, well, if everything only has subjective or relative value, that is, if things are valuable only because people value them, then there are only hypothetical imperatives. Right? That is, Okay, you value something, you want something, you desire something. So that gives it value for you. But its value is contingent upon you valuing it. Without you valuing it, uh, it it has no value. And that's why hypothetical imperatives, following them, is always optional. Well, if something doesn't have value for me, then I have no reason to follow the rule, right? But if it does have value for me, I do. So if there were only hypothetical imperatives, there mm, for Kant there would be no morality. Right? If there are only things of relative value, there would only be hypothetical imperatives, and therefore there'd be no categorical imperatives, and therefore there'd be no true moral imperatives. Because think about what the categorical imperative uh, says. It says basically you have to follow this rule no matter what your feelings are, no matter what your wants and desires are. Right? And then there is the question, well, then why should I follow it? Why should we follow the categorical imperative? Well, we follow hypothetical imperatives because things have value to us because of our wants, our desires, what we happen to want. The idea of a categorical imperative it must be followed because something has value in itself. That is, if there were something which had intrinsic value, that would mean that I would have no choice but to value it and follow the imperative of treating it uh, as an end, basically. So the whole idea of a categorical imperative demands something which is valuable in itself, something which has objective value. If there were not anything in the world, in the whole world, which had intrinsic value, that is, that had value because of what it was rather than because somebody valued it, then there would be no categorical imperatives. There has to be something which has objective and intrinsic value. And that would be the basis for a categorical imperative. And that's what he finds here when he says, now I say man, and generally any rational being exists as an end in himself. That is, to say that something is an end in itself is tantamount to saying that it has intrinsic or objective value, not merely as a means to be arbitrarily used by this or that will, but in all his actions, whether they concern himself or other rational beings, must be regarded at the same time as an end. So there we are. There is something in the world that has intrinsic value, and it is us, persons, rational beings. So for Kant, there is something that has intrinsic value. There is something that has objective value, that has absolute value, and that is the rational being. That, i.e., that is the person. A person, a rational creature, has intrinsic value and is the reason that there can be a categorical imperative. Because I must, no matter how I feel about somebody, I have to value them. I have to grant them value. Even if I hate them, even if they disgust me, if they are a person, a rational creature, I must treat them with respect because of the kind of thing they are. It gets a little twisty here in this paragraph that leads up to the second categorical imperative, but there's some really essential stuff in it. Starting here, he says, all objects of the inclinations, of the desires, have only a conditional worth. That's the idea of having relative value. Uh, and then we skip ahead here. Uh, he says, beings whose existence depends not on our will but on nature's have, nevertheless, if they are rational beings, only a relative value as means. And there he's talking about animals. which is a very controversial thing. For him, animals are not persons. Animals are not, don't have intrinsic value. Beings whose existence depends not on our will but on nature's have, nevertheless, if they are irrational beings, only a relative value as means, and therefore are called things. Okay, and that's the big word here. To contrast with person is a thing. Rational beings, on the contrary, are called persons because their very nature points them out as ends in themselves. That is, as something which must not be used merely as means, and so far, therefore, restricts freedom of action and is an object of respect. These, therefore, are not merely subjective ends whose existence has a worth for us as an effect of our action, but objective ends, that is, things whose existence is an end in itself, an end, moreover, for which no other can be substituted. That is, each of us persons, you and I, as rational creatures, are unique and irreplaceable. We have intrinsic, absolute value, and therefore cannot be used as means, must always be treated as ends in ourselves. And this leads up to, again, the actual categorical imperative here. So act as to treat humanity, whether in thine own person or in that of any other, in every case as an end, never as means only. So that's how we sort of get to the second categorical imperative. The idea is that a categorical imperative, if it's possible, demands that there must be something which is an end for everybody because it's an end in itself. The thing that has subjective value has an end for somebody because they value it, not because it's an end in themselves. The thing that has intrinsic value, things like persons, who are not actually things, they're beings, they are ends for everybody, right? Because they are ends in themselves, because they have intrinsic value. So it is a little twisty, and maybe some of the concepts here aren't that easy to grasp, but you can see the connection. That is, the idea is that a categorical imperative is only possible. That is, it's only possible to have an absolute binding moral rule on people if there is something that everybody should value, not depending upon their whims, their personal desires, their wants and needs. There has to be something that everybody must find valuable. And there's only one thing that he finds, and that is the person, the rational creature, which is intrinsically valuable. And so that's the rock of the second categorical imperative. When you meet a person, your freedom of action is restricted, he says. Why? Because you know that you must treat that person with respect. You can't use them. When we deal with things, non-persons, our freedom of action is not restricted. We can do whatever we want with them as long as no other person is involved. But once we're dealing with a person, we know, without being taught, that there are severe restrictions on what we can do to that person. We have to treat them with respect. We have to recognize their autonomy and their dignity and treat them as an end in themselves and never as a means to an end.